health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near. Praise him in glad adoration. Praise to the Lord who o'er all things so wondrously reigneth. Shelters thee under his wings, he so gently sustaineth. Hast thou not seen how thy desires there have been granted in what he ordaineth? Praise to the Lord who doth prosper thy work and defend thee. Surely his goodness and mercy here daily attend thee. Ponder anew what the Almighty can do, if with his love he befriend thee. Praise to the Lord, oh let all that is in me adore him. All that have life and breath come now with praises before him. Let the Amen sound from his people again, gladly for all we adore him. And let the Amen sound from his people again, gladly for all we adore him. There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains, lose all their guilty stains, lose all their guilty stains, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains. The dying thief rejoiced to see that fountain in his day, and there may I, though vile as he, wash all my sins away, dear dying Lamb, thy precious blood shall never lose its power, till all the ransomed church of God be saved, to sin no more. Be saved, to sin no more. Be saved, to sin no more. Till all the ransomed church of God be saved, to sin no more. Ere since by faith I saw the stream, thy flowing wounds supply, redeeming love has been my theme, and shall be till I die, and shall be till I die, and shall be till I die. Redeeming love has been my theme, and shall be till I die. To Jesus I surrender all, to Him I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily live. I surrender all, surrender, Lord. I give myself to Thee. Fill me with Thy love and power. Let Thy blessing fall on me. I surrender all, and I surrender all, and all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. I surrender all, and I surrender all, and all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all.
1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah, in Ephas Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him Aminadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the man who stood by him, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, So shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and where there came a lion or a bear, and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and struck him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and struck him, and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward, and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took out a stone, and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran, and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'araim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite."
A number of years ago, John Lawling's cartoons appeared in several editions of Christianity Today under the caption, "What If?" It featured a series of biblical stories giving alternative endings. One of Lawling's cartoons was that of our story today, David and Goliath. David was depicted as a scrawny little kid whose sling was dragging on the ground, carrying a small little stick. He was being towered over by this muscle man, this giant named Goliath, who had a tattoo on his bicep entitled Mother. He was a formidable monster towering over this little kid. Lawling had a caption, one little sentence that said, "We forgive you." It was, as I said, a humorous stab at an alternative ending. What if David and Israel forgave Goliath? And what if Goliath accepted that forgiveness? Then Israel's history as we know it would be changed. David may not even be king. Redemptive history as we know it would have been changed. Well, we laugh at that, but we have, over the centuries with this story, created our own alternative endings. As the motto, "Familiarity breeds contempt," says, David and Goliath is one of the most popular, famous stories in all of the Bible, probably in the top 5 that even those that aren't even Christians know. And over time, it has developed into a series of applications that the original story probably never intended. David and Goliath is used to depict overcoming the odds in sports when one opponent is outmatched and outmanned and outgunned. But we remember David and Goliath and take inspiration in our sports competition. I've heard 1 Samuel chapter 17 be used for overcoming bullies in our life. That like David overcame the bully Goliath, we can overcome those that make our lives miserable. Still further, I've heard David and Goliath's story be used for personal inspiration of overcoming the giants of our own soul that manifest themselves in gigantic ways: loneliness, anxiety, guilt. Each day we're to go out and slay them. In other words, we, like the cartoonist, have created our own alternative what-if ending. Because for all these scenarios, the point is, that is not what the story of David and Goliath means. Not even close. The story of David and Goliath has nothing to do with sports, your own personal bullies, or your self-esteem problems. It has everything to do with what the text says and what it means in its context. And I want to tell this story again. I hope to show its beauty. The hints of its major theme can be within the words and phrases that are used throughout. One phrase that is used repetitively 6 different times, as a matter of fact, is a form word that is translated mock or insult or deride or defraud. In other words, that seems to be the main action line in this story, that someone is mocking someone else. Another phrase that is not used repetitively throughout this text, but actually used sparingly, not only here, but in the entire Old Testament. A phrase that may shock us that it's used so sparingly. In fact, it only occurs here and in one other place in the entire Old Testament. It is the phrase, "I come in the name of the Lord." If we take these 2 phrases, we can construct, I think, what is the main drama of this story, the main point of our sermon. David is coming to fight for the name of the Lord that is being mocked and trampled upon. Or maybe a bit more provocative, David is coming to fight against those who mock the name of the Lord. If you understand that, I think you have this story. Now, I'm going to tell this story. You probably know it and could probably tell it yourself. But I'm going to develop this into 3 acts, like a play. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 1, which will be most of the sermon, will be the great story told here in 1 Samuel 17 and its messages for us. The second act is what I call the greater part of the story of 1 Samuel 17. And act number 3, finally, will be the greatest part of this story of 1 Samuel 17. Now, just to remind us, because we've been in 1 Samuel for a while, this is a history book. And as such, I think it ought to be presented that way. Expositional preaching is not only the context and text and preaching it accurately, but also the style. I don't preach 1 Samuel the way I would, say, James or Paul's letters. And it's not intended that way. This is a history book to teach Israelite history and God's people history. And the historian has done it in a storytelling way, which is personally the way I think history ought to be taught. Now, he provides some background that I think is helpful for this story if we're to understand it. In 1 Samuel 17, we are reintroduced to the arch rivals of Israel, the Philistines. We haven't watched them in a chapter, but here they emerge again. They're really the Joker to the Israelite Batman. For 200 years, they are locked into an on-again, off-again struggle with Israel. They were a little superior to Israel during this Iron Age. They outmanned them, outgunned them, outskilled them in terms of armaments. And the Philistines were really sea people. They had 6 major cities close to the Mediterranean Sea, and they viewed Israel as hill people, hillbillies, that had sort of a rough connection with 12 tribes. As long as the Hebrews behaved themselves, Philistia would tolerate them and even tax them. But of recently, in the events leading up to chapter 17, Israel had gotten too big for their political britches. Not once, but twice, as we have already seen, the crown prince, the son of King Saul, Jonathan, had, in a surprising turn of events, routed 2 different Philistine garrisons, sending thousands of armies back to Philistia. They regrouped and they come back with an iron fist. They come into Israelite territory, into the land of Benjamin, And there is where we pick up in chapter 17, where King Saul, who himself knows the land of Benjamin, that's where he's from, has formed a local militia to go out and fight against Philistia that are invading their lands again. Now, this local militia are not professional soldiers. Saul does not have a national army. They are unarmed, inexperienced, basically farmers and peasants come out to defend their land. Saul and Philistia meet in a rocky area about 13 miles west of Bethlehem. There are two mountain ranges, and Philistia is on one side, Israel's on the other. There is a flat land valley between them with a small brook that goes between and cuts that valley. Saul and his army have chosen the high ground. They have entrenched themselves into some rocky ledges, so the Philistines would have to march across this flat valley in the open field, cross a ravine, a brook, and then scale uphill in mountain, cliffy, rocky area. It would be virtual suicide. So how 1 Samuel 17 begins is in what we call a stalemate. Both armies have no activity, no fighting, no bloodshed, nothing. The Philistines come up with an ingenious plan. They decide that they'll try to bait Israel out into the open ground and fight them. And they do it by sending in their best warrior to sort of trash talk Israel into fighting. Now, what they do is actually a fairly common thing in the ancient world. They challenge their best against Israel's best. The way to do this was to decrease bloodshed, and the agreement would be, look, we fight to the death, and whoever wins, it's winner take all. And that's exactly the opening story of 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're introduced to this warrior. He stands as one of the Bible's most infamous villains. His name is Goliath. He comes from one of the 6 Philistine cities of Gath. Now, centuries later, when we tell this story, we call him the giant. David fought the giant. But actually, nowhere in this story is the word giant used to describe Goliath. Actually, the term that is used 3 different occasions to describe him is the term champion. Goliath is the undisputed, undefeated champion warrior of Philistia. He's never lost a fight. He's 20-0, all KOs. And one can understand why. If you read the description line by line of Goliath, we realize that he is a 9-foot, 9-inch tall warrior. The armor alone that he wears weighs 126 pounds. The iron head of his javelin weighs a whopping 16 pounds. This is a fearsome dude. And so it is no shock that we read at the end of verse 11 that King Saul and all of Israel are both impressed by him and depressed by him. And so that is the first part of our story. But verse 12 turns it all on its head when the historian writes, "Now David." We are given David's pedigree in verse 12. We met him, of course, a chapter before, but now we're given another reminder of who he is. He is Jesse's youngest son, and a repetitive feature about him is that he is a shepherd boy. David, if you really want to do some amazing reading in a creative and clever way, remove all of the details of this chapter and only read the words of David. If you do so, you're going to know what is going on in the story. You're going to know what David is going to do about it, and you're going to know why he's going to do about it, why he's going to do something. These are the first words ever recorded David saying. So for the first time in the Bible's history book of 1 Samuel, we get David speaking. I don't mean to imply that he never spoke before in his life. I mean, quite literally, these are the first words recorded. And each of them really is, each of these words are a theology lesson. They teach us sirloin steak theology, some of the richest theology in all of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's a good reminder for us that no matter what fearsome obstacles come our way, we should always have a theocentric mindset. We should always start with God. What does God have to say about this? Because we find David doing it. He is a shepherd boy dispatched to provide food and resources to his 3 oldest brothers that are being conscripted to fight in this army. Remember, it's close to Bethlehem. So about a day's walk back and forth, and David has evidently gone up there several times. He goes up to hear the reports of war and to provide his brothers provision. And on one of his trips, he finds out about Goliath. Evidently, this has been going on, but he didn't know. And one of the soldiers say, hey, listen to this guy. He's coming down. Listen to what he's going to say. And Goliath begins his defamation of Israel, and David is livid. And he asks the very first words recorded that are pretty important, that they are repeated not once but twice in this story, or they are told that they're repeated. He asks there in verse 26, what will be done for the man who strikes down this Philistine and will turn away derision from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should deride or mock the ranks of the living God? David wants to know what is going to be done with this pest that is mocking Israel and Israel's God. Now, don't miss the contrast here with David and Israel and King Saul. Their response to Goliath's mockings was fear, and fear can paralyze. These soldiers should have been soldiering. Fighters fight, warriors make war, and yet they were paralyzed by fear of Goliath, so much so that 40 days go by, a month and a half, every day, sometimes twice a day, this giant is allowed to taunt God. So much so that they know when he's going to come out, they know what he's going to say. So long that King Saul now has posted a reward for the demise of Goliath. So they are paralyzed by fear, and that fear, because it paralyzed them, causes them not to act. It's rather sad to see. Men, when God's name is being maligned, do nothing. Thank God David is not one of those men. He sees this guy. He sees what he's doing to God. He responds accordingly. My God lives, and I'm not going to tolerate this. And so for David, it was a resolved conclusion. I don't care if it's you, Eliab. I don't care if it's me. I don't care if it's Saul. I don't care if it's Jack Squat Oak Tree. This guy is going to be taken out. I don't care how he's going to be taken out. Poisoned, take a ride down Cliff Drive, wink, wink, sleep with the fishes, concrete blocks on one's shoes. I don't care, but he's going downtown Charlie Brown when I get through. David was resolved to ask this question. Now, when he does, he is interestingly immediately met by another gigantic problem. And that is big brother Eliab, who is a soldier in Saul's army, maybe a sergeant, 3 stripes. And Eliab comes in, basically, he is the contempt of Goliath. He shows the same contempt for David that Goliath does when Eliab looks at his brother and says, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the evilness of your heart. You've come down to see the battle. Now, if Eliab was so worried about David, why wasn't he doing something? But we can see all of this contempt, this insulting of David. You're just a little shepherd boy. You come up here to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Why don't you go back where you belong? For David's part, to respond to this really is amazing and instructive, isn't it? He doesn't respond with tit for tat. He simply asks, "What have I done?" And then he turns his back, walks away, and basically ignores Eliab, only to repeat the question he asked prior. A lot of Christians, sadly, will get their feelings hurt, will get upset about something and make mountains out of molehills and molehills out of mountains. They'll get all worked up on secondary matters and negate the important matters. The Apostle Paul brings this up in his pastoral letters and says, look, a soldier does not entangle himself in civilian life. Stay on point for the gospel. Too many people major on the minors and minor on the majors and get knocked off the course. David would not allow himself to get caught up in some sibling rivalry by a bitter older brother, go tit for tat and get to an argument. No, he was single-minded. This giant needs to be taken care of. Then he is conferred with King Saul, who hears about this little teenager, admires his pluck, likes his spitfireness, and calls him in. Now, if Eliab, who acts like Goliath in showing contempt for David, Saul acts like Goliath in having the mind of the giant. He brings David in thinking, I'm going to have some brave warrior I didn't know about, and what should his wondering eyes see but a teenager and a shepherd boy? And Saul, here in chapter 17, mimics the exhortation of God in chapter 16. Man looks on the outward, but God looks on the heart. Saul probably pats him on the back and says, I appreciate your effort here, your intention, but look, you are not able to fight this guy because you're but a youth, and he's been fighting from his youth. That must have rubbed David to his quick. You're not able. You don't have the ability to fight because you're too young. Saul, of course, is offering a mere opinion, and David responds with facts, which is always good in our life. We tend, when we go through our own adversities, to lean on our feelings, on our senses, on our impressions, rather than on the bedrock truth of God's word. David wants the facts. And so David whips out his CV to Saul and says, look, Your Royal Highness, let's talk about a few things. And David shows his resume. Now, there are things that we know about this shepherd boy. We know that being a shepherd out in the field, taking care of the flock, means you have a lot of alone time. There's no record of armies being shepherds. You're pretty much playing solitaire. And we know for a fact that David had time well spent out in those fields. He wrote a lot of poetry, for example, and he set that poetry to music. And so many of those singing poems became in a hymn book known as the Psalms. You and I, when we're discouraged and we're hurting and need comfort, we run to these poems penned by a shepherd boy who wrote them out in the field. The Lord is my shepherd, for example. So David, the shepherd boy, was a poet, a musician. We also know that when he spent time out in those fields, he meditates on God. He tells us this time and time again. Maybe he also daydreamed of what his life in God would be like 10 years from now. But here, David tells Saul that one of my jobs as a shepherd boy was not here to be a musician or a poet or a meditator, but to be a fighter. To be a shepherd means that you had better be a fighter, because there may be days where the only thing between predator and prey is you. So you'd better learn how to get mean and nasty, because if you don't, you might be dead, and those sheep certainly will. And he tells the story that once there was a lion in the fold. I didn't say to that lion, lion, you're the king of the beast. You're taking care of the food chain. What's one lamb? Off you go. No. I went out and I killed that lion. Another time a bear came in the sheepfold and I didn't negotiate with the bear. I didn't say, hey, Mr. Bear, over there is honey in that oak tree. Why don't you take it instead of some sheep? No, I went up to him, I pulled his beard, and with my bare hands, I killed him. God let me kill the lion and the bear. In fact, if you look at verses 35 and verse 36, you have David's resume of being a killer. 3 times he uses the action strike down. I struck down the lion, I struck down the bear, and this giant, this Goliath, he's going to be just like them. It is a foregone conclusion, King. He's going down. I'm taking him out. I'm taking him out. Why? We are told, verse 36, because he has mocked the ranks of the living God. He has declared war on God himself. And I will not let my God be dragged through the ringer. I defended my father's sheep, and I'm going to defend the sheep of my God. I have been of recently enamored through this very unique time in our history. I've been watching the ESPN documentary called The Last Dance, of featuring Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. Now, I watched them through the 80s, late 80s into the 90s, so I remember these games well. I remember their personnel. A lot of the details and behind the scenes I didn't know, and it's fascinating. And one of the subplots that Michael Jordan, who to me is the greatest basketball player of all time, I mean, he's never been beaten in a final. He's 6 for 6, for Pete's sake. And he uses this for his argument that the team should not be broken up. This is one of the sub-themes. The team's going to be broken up, sold off before they retire. And Jordan makes the case, look, we haven't lost. No one has beaten us. Every championship we've played in, we've won. And as he's talking, golden trophies go by the screen. 1, 2, 3, 6 of them. I find that that's what David is doing with Saul. A lion, a bear, this 9'9" Gath guy is one of them. He's going to fall like dominoes. I'm going to drop him like a bad habit. And the reason why I'm able to do it, you talk about he's been a warrior from his youth. So have I. I've been a fighter. That's what I do. I fight to protect God's own. And God is going to give me the ability to do it. Notice verse 37. Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. This is instructive, I think, for the people of God, isn't it? That when we go through our own trials, maybe by evildoers, the odds are against us, that we should recall the promises of God like David. We should go back to the past. The problem with a lot of Christians is that we have short-term memory losses. But you'll find in important matters of the Bible, the Lord is always telling us to remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Every time you eat of the Lord's body and blood, remember me, Jesus says. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget his benefits. Part of our problem when we go through today's trial is we've forgotten yesterday's faithfulness of God. You know, a Christian will write in the dust God's benefits, but put our anxieties on marble. A Christian sometimes will write our afflictions on brass, but God's promises in water. We are so quick to forget. David is a lesson in this day, this giant's going to be just like yesterday. God was faithful to me then, he will be faithful to me now. You need to understand that, dear child, that you're struggling and need encouragement. A trial that you're going through, you went through it, a similar one 2 years ago, and God brought you encouragement. An unanswered prayer that you're anxious about today, you went through it 6 years ago, and God answered, didn't he? God bats 1,000. He never has a bad day. Remember those past victories of God and recall them like David. Well, the story finally gets to actual combat, where David goes down after trying on Saul's armor and saying, not this, goes down to the brook to meet Goliath. Goliath shows contempt for him, laughs at him, reasons against him as David collects his stones. There are some interesting elements to this combat story. First, never again is Goliath referred to in the story as Goliath. From here on out, he is simply referred to as the Philistine. Again, to accentuate, he is an enemy of Israel, and as such, he is God's enemy. The second curious but significant feature is there is more space given to David's speech against Goliath than the actual combat with him. If you think of a Super Bowl, you know how much time is spent hyping up the Super Bowl? If you just DVR it and watch it through, skipping commercials, skipping the halftime show, you'll be done with that in less than 90 minutes. But it's a 4.5-hour extravaganza because of all the hype. Well, that's sort of like what's going on. The story spends more time preparing for the demise of Goliath than the actual demise. And David's speech is almost as if tomorrow you're going to read in the paper, the great giant KO'd in the first round right after the bell was sounded. People are going to be stunned that he dropped. The fight just got started and that was it. You talk about anticlimactic. And when it happens, and it's going to happen, everyone needs to know why it happened. Because the Lord did it. Notice verse 45. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head. Later, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. You can imagine Goliath here listening to this, laughing it off, being more and more indignant and showing contempt for this little yahoo, pimple-faced, calic-infested, freckle-faced little teenager. Goliath, you are the fly and I'm the fly swatter. Goliath, your dead corpse is mine. I'm the lawnmower. Israel saw a giant. David saw the Lord. Israel saw defeat from a giant. David saw victory from the Lord. Israel questioned, if you kill that giant. David said, when I kill that giant. Israel said, he is so big, we cannot hit him. David announced, he's so big, I cannot miss him. Eliab told David in verse 28, you are a pain. Saul told David in verse 33, "You are too green." Goliath told David in verse 42, "You are too puny." But God told the entire earth, "I am God. The battle is mine. I will use this boy to fight for my name, and victory belongs to me." Now, as I said at the very beginning of this story, the forms for mock and defy and insult are used 6 different places in this story. In verse 10, Goliath announces and admits that he mocks the armies of Israel. Israel's troops, in verse 25, acknowledge that he's mocking them. In verse 26, twice, David recognizes that the mockery of Israel is synonymous with the mockery of God. David then asserts this same point with Saul in verse 36 and again with Goliath in verse 45. The driving central focus of this story is the honor of the Lord God's name, his reputation, his glory that he will not give to anyone else. David is essentially saying throughout this story, look, Yahweh's reputation is at stake. That matters to me. Matters enough that I'll risk my life on it. And so at the beginning of this day, when David walked the 13 miles from Bethlehem to this battle scene, he was David the shepherd boy. But as he cuts the giant's head off with his own sword, and he shows it to Saul and Abner's armies that rout the Philistines, David begins as a shepherd boy, but he ends as a giant slayer. And victory belongs to the Lord. Well, that is Act 1, the great story. Act 2, quickly, is the greater part of this story, and that is that 1 Samuel 17 is couched into a larger history. It's not on its own. If we leave it on its own, we come up with modern reinterpretations. David and Goliath is a sports metaphor. David and Goliath is massaging more my morality. David and Goliath is me fighting my self-esteem problem. But it is couched in a long history of Israel, a history that began with Israel demanding of God to give them a king. God said, "You don't want a king." "Yes, we do." "No, you don't." "Yes, we do." And they told God, in effect, in chapter 8, and it was repeated in chapter 9, that the main purpose of our king is to deliver us from our enemies. Now, that is not a wrong thing to ask. This is something God promised them earlier in the Pentateuch. In chapter 9, they specify that that deliverance of their enemies was namely the Philistines. That was Saul's number 1 job description when he was anointed. And yet in chapter 17, we find him doing nothing. Now, he's assembled those armies. You could say, we'll give him a little credit. But as king, he should have been the one first to go out and to combat with Goliath and these Philistines. But here we have the sitting, reigning king doing nothing, not even fulfill his job description that was given to him by the disobedient Israelites wanting him as king. Now comes God's appointed king, the man after God's own heart, who has the Spirit of God rushed on him. And he will deliver Israel from their enemies. He will give a credential of a Messiah, an anointed one, whose number 1 job description is to save God's people from their enemies. This is what we see David doing here and what he continues to do. As Israel will later laud him, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So the greater part of the story is the anointed David, unbeknownst to anyone here yet, is acting already as the anointed one, delivering Israel from her wicked enemies. Act 3 is the greatest part of our story. As I said before, there is one phrase in this chapter that David says to Goliath in his great speech that is only used here and one other place in the Old Testament. It is the phrase, "I come in the name of the Lord." David will write a hymn years later after he is crowned king of Israel. That hymn becomes what is known as a messianic hymn or a hymn of ascent. It is Psalm 118. There David writes it as the anointed one, the king of Israel. But he writes it with an eye on a future king that would come, a future anointed one that would come. And the New Testament writers take that hymn and use it to apply to Jesus in several different ways. One of the phrases that David writes in Psalm 118 is a phrase only that he uses here: the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The Son of David comes, the anointed one, the Messiah, as God's representative. And he comes in part to rescue his people from their enemies, to liberate them, to save them. This is displayed on the first day of Passion Week, where Jesus gets on a donkey and he rides into Jerusalem, and people spontaneously begin to throw branches and cloaks in his wake, and they sing the messianic psalm of David, and they sing the line, "Hosanna, Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The only place it's used in the New Testament is used to Jesus. It is a victory parade. In fact, we call it the triumphal entry. And Jesus is seen there as the anointed one, the Son of David who will rescue his people from their enemies. And he, in many ways, mirrors David in so many aspects on the field of 1 Samuel chapter 17. When David came, he came indignant of the wickedness going on, and he was going to do something about it. When he did, he was mocked at his lack of credentials. You're a shepherd boy. You're too young. Jesus himself was derided over his credentials. You're a carpenter's son. You're from Nazareth. You hang out with Galileans, prostitutes, tax collectors, the riffraff of society. You weren't educated in the best synagogues of Jerusalem. You didn't come up from the right channels. Who do you think you are? Go back where you came from. Like David, he fought with very humble weapons. Jesus fought his battle over our enemy not with a crown and not with a throne, but with a cross that utterly baffled his culture as to a credential of the Messiah. Like David, who went in that battle alone, Jesus went into our battle and achieved victory on his own with the help of nobody else. Just like David, who announced that the battle is the Lord, Jesus announced salvation is from God alone. And when Jesus died and rose again, he, like David, there on the plains of 1 Samuel 17, chopped the head of the giant off. Jesus whacked off our greatest enemy of all, the enemy of death, making a public display of it, championing over it, crushing the head of the snake. O grave, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So you see, to apply the story of David and Goliath redemptively is not to apply it morally. I have a bully fighting me. I have a sport competition I want to overcome. I have self-esteem problem. No. The battle has already been fought. The giant has already been slayed. Our enemy has already been put to death. The day death died was when Jesus said, "It is finished." And it is finished. And we live our lives in that reality. Reminds me of a story I heard of a young boy who brought to show and tell at his school the tail of a lion. And he told his friends, "With my pocket knife, I cut the tail off this lion." And of course, they didn't believe him. But then they felt the tail, and it was a real lion's tail. And then they were in awe of this kid's courage. They wanted to know how this happened. And they made him swear, you cut the tail off this lion. Yes, I did. Finally, one of his chums asked the obvious question, well, why didn't you bring the lion's head? That would have been more impressive. To which the young boy said, well, the head was already gone. Well, it didn't make the boy's struggle and his achievement that grand. Brothers and sisters, the battle has been fought and won. And all of the irritations and adversities we go through has been achieved already in its fullest by the achievement of Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection. Imagine tonight if you were awakened by a burglar in your house that came into your bedroom, flipped on the lights, and stuck a 12-gauge shotgun in your face and said, "Don't move." You would be paralyzed in fear. But if your 7-year-old boy did it and stuck a water pistol in your face saying the same thing, you'd laugh at him. Why? Because he's not fearsome at all. O grave, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ our Lord. O victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is due to him. He plunged me to victory beneath that cleansing flood.